Good evening, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. 28th of June 2012. The Australian Parliament has had itself tied in knots for a couple of days because people keep showing up in boats on the coastline and they would like to come to Australia because they don't like living in Absurdistan or Iraq, since we sent our army over there to wreak a little bit of death and destruction and salute the American flag, prop up the ANZUS alliance on the theory that because 200 million Indonesians can drink more Coca-Cola than 20 million Australians can, therefore the Americans are never going to help Australia in any regional conflict, no matter what Australia does, to tag along and fight whoever America wants to fight wherever they want to fight them. So anyway, we've got these people who show up in boats, and the white Australian population is utterly firmly convinced that they're about to be overrun and chased off the continent because we have this deep cultural memory of how flaming easy it is to steal Australia if you show up in a boat. We did it! We did it! With a bunch of redcoats, with brown Bess muskets. And it wasn't the guns that stole Australia, it was the horses. It was the ability to ride up to a bunch of blackfellas and fire off 2 or 3 muskets and a couple of pistols, and then ride back out of spear range and reload all the guns and go in and do it again. It was the horses as well as the guns that helped us steal Australia. And I say us because I'm 30 seconds white. I was raised as a white fella, but you know, maybe the training didn't take. That could be why I can carve a boomerang and play a little bit of a didgeridoo for 30 seconds and even know a little bit about bull roarers and rain dancing. But I was raised to be white. And I remember when I was a kid, Australia was a social democracy. It was an egalitarian society based on the principle of the fair go, largely because most of the people were of convict stock. We remembered what it was like to be beaten up by a fascist government system. But you see, times have changed. You know, Kevin Rudd made the apology to the stolen generation. Before that, Paul Keating admitted that it was we who took the children away, it was we who stole the land, it was we who raped the women, it was we who shot the men, it was we who poisoned the waterholes. It was we who introduced the sheep and the foxes and the cats and the rabbits and the cane toads. It was we who stole Australia from the Aborigines and we who stuffed the continent. Well, I've just been listening to Senator Christine Milne, the leader of the Australian Greens, in the Senate, and surprise, surprise, after all day coming to a stalemate, figuring out what they're not going to do about the boat people, because the choices appear to be to go with the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, who want to break every international convention Australia's ever been a party to, because we're afraid of the boat people. They might steal Australia because we did it. We know how easy it is. Or go with the Greens theory, which is, let's just process the aspiring refugees on Australian territory. Stop trying to palm them off on an island somewhere or ship them out to Malaysia to be beaten under the Malaysian laws. Let's just process them here. Okay, so they've had a day of utter stalemate. At lunchtime today, suddenly posted on the Australian parliamentary agenda was the information that tonight they're going to debate and pass a bill called the Building Stronger Futures Bill. And this is an extension of Flack Jacket Johnny the Snivelling Coward's Northern Territory Intervention Bill. The Northern Territory Intervention Bill has resulted in a doubling of the Aboriginal suicide rates and self-harm rates among teenagers. It's been the most dismal social failure and step backwards in the history of race relations in Australia, and therefore the Australian government is claiming that as an evidence-based approach we're going to continue it and extend it, and it's going to operate not only in the Northern Territory but also all over Australia, and it's going to be extended to everybody who's in receipt of social welfare payments. Right? It appears that my generation has decided that it's time to make life hard for the poorest children in Australia. Why would that be? Why would we want to do that? Could it be that somebody wants to stir up a rebelliousness of the youth in order to generate some discontent so as to justify something of a crackdown in order to have a law and order led economic recovery, employing the otherwise useless buffheads who would like to stand in neat straight rows in neatly starched trousers with shined boots. And they want to feel like heroes. And why have we got so many aspiring fascist stormtroopers in Australia? Well, I think you can look partly to Flack Jacket Johnny, the snivelling coward, and his response to the fact that Nelson Mandela had been let out of jail in white South Africa. Now, why do I say that? I say that because I can remember when Australia was an egalitarian democracy, where the principle of a fair go for all was paramount. And back in those days, it was rare to meet a white South African in Australia, because to be a white South African in Australia, it meant you didn't want to live in a slave-based economy in a fascist dictatorship. And if you didn't want to live in white South Africa, you were allowed to go, but you had to leave your money behind. And there weren't many people who had money in white South Africa who wanted to leave their money behind. So they stayed there and they got rich in the slave-based economy. But there came a day when Nelson Mandela was let out of jail and the African National Congress came to power in white South Africa. And they said, okay, you want to go? Piss off. Go away. And strangely, a lot of the white South Africans decided that, seeing as the apartheid state in the Republic of South Africa had been based on the Queensland system of native policing, they thought that Australia might be a pretty good country to bring their ill-gotten gains to. And what did Johnny Howard, Flack Jacket Johnny, the snivelling coward, what did he do? He instituted a business migration scheme where anybody who had more than $1 million could come to Australia with no questions asked. And suddenly, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, every time you'd hear an academic talking from a right-wing think tank, they had a white South African accent. They were a Whenwe. When we were in Rhodesia, when we were back on the Cape, when we had 15 servants, when you could beat a servant. The Whenwes. And they insinuated themselves into our universities and they started teaching their free market, fascist, neoconservative, capitalist doctrines to the Australians who were allowed into the universities if they could afford to pay to get into them, because my generation, who received free university educations, they decided that they were going to shut that door. They didn't want their kids having a free university education. Oh, shit, no. Only for the rich. We got a bloke in this town, one of the last refugees to get out of the apartheid regime in white South Africa. And in order to get his money out of South Africa, he spent his life savings building a sailboat. Once he got the sailboat to the point where it'd float, then he sold his house and spent that kitting it out. Once he filled his boat up with food, he said to the government, I'm going to go for a bit of a sail, fellas, just, see how it goes. And he sailed his friggin' boat from South Africa to Sydney, pulled it in, and he put a for sale sign on the boat, and he sold his boat, and that gave him the money to drive around Australia and find a block of land and build a house. And yeah, smart man, very smart man. I admire him greatly. But not long after he did that, Johnny Howard let the drawbridge down. They let Nelson Mandela out of jail. And all the fascist, right-wing, money-grubbing arseholes in South Africa migrated to Australia. And they've flooded the bureaucracy, and they've flooded the universities, and they've flooded the public servants. It's just a bloody tragedy. Australia has gone down the right-wing gurgle hole. We're so far down the gurgle hole, we are run by an utterly schizoid government that wants to simultaneously dig the place up and sell it to China while sucking up to the Americans and letting the Americans put another bloody military base here. And I say another bloody military base here because we've got Northwest Cape communicating with subsea radio waves to the submarines, and we've got Pine Gap communicating to the geosynchronous spy satellite that surveys bloody East Asia. It looks down on China and Vietnam and the Philippines and Japan and the northern bit of East Russia, Siberia. Right? The satellite that looks down on all that downloads to Pine Gap. That's what Pine Gap's for, right? So now the Americans have realised that China's actually growing pretty big, and China can thump Okinawa with medium-range ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads, because China's got slightly more nuclear warheads than Israel has, at least that's what they admit to. On the other hand, in the last, I think it's 40 years, China's built 5,000 miles of underground railways, and they've got an underground nuclear warhead assembly plant. And there are some people who suggest China may in fact have 5,000 missiles in underground silos, ready to fight a three-stage thermonuclear exchange. So the Americans have picked up on this, and they would like to, quote, stage through Darwin 2,500 American stormtroopers. What's China's response to that? Well, we've got this fat old lady who looks like a frog in Western Australia. Her father was an insane racist. Lang Hancock had the idea that he wanted to build a harbour to export minerals in Western Australia, and he wanted the Australian government to make every Aboriginal social service payment in Australia payable only at the bank in his new town he was going to build, so that any Aborigine on social security was going to have to go to Lang Hancockville in order to cash their social security cheque. And as he said in his letter to the government, printed in the newspaper in 1982, I think it was, I was a student nurse, we were all flabbergasted, he said he was going to put contraceptives in the water supply and breed them out of existence within a generation. Right, well, his daughter, Gina Farts Rhinestones, she's the richest woman in the world. She hasn't done anything, she just collects royalties from the company that her father set up. She's organised to put pressure on the Australian government so they'll allow her to bring in 1,700 Chinese workers to set up a mine. And my bet is they're going to come with 1,000 security guards, and the Chinese are going to match the American investment of troops in Darwin with Chinese workers and guards in Western Australia. Thanks, Gina Farts Rhinestones. The way I see it, things is crook in Tullarook and they's going to get worse. We'll all be ruined, said Hanrahan, and about the only salvation I can see is if somebody pulls the plug from the petroleum pipeline. If the world ceases to have distribution globally of petroleum, yeah, that'll put a brake on the capitalist industrial disaster that's happening to the biosphere. Another thing that would be really good would be a Class X solar flare. As NASA reported to the National Academy of Science in America, who reported to Congress, we'd get 15 minutes warning. The flare would take 90 seconds to melt the transformers attached to every power distribution grid on the planet. It would take 7 to 9 years for the technicians to rewire and rebuild the transformers if somebody feeds them salad sandwiches and freshly manufactured copper wire. However, there's only 72 hours of healthcare in the cities because that's how much fuel there is for the backup generator at the hospital. There's 30 days coal stockpiled above the ground beside the power stations, but that won't be very useful because there's no distribution grid. All the coal seams are below water table level. So as soon as you take away the power, the coal mines fill up with water. And without electricity, you can't pump water, you can't pump sewage. You can't refrigerate anything in the cities, you've got no traffic lights, and you can't pump fuel out of the bowser at the service station. So a Class X solar flare, that would reduce planet Earth to a pre-industrial level in 24 hours. That may be what the biosphere needs. In the meantime, I guess they're going to start teaching goose-stepping to the high school students pretty soon. Victory, hurrah! In the grateful nation of Australia, a country full of white racist farts. Sometimes I'm really, really glad I don't fit in, you know, because it means I'm not as big an arsehole as I could be. Ciao.